In the fall of 1888, London shuddered from unprecedented crimes. A serial maniac not only killed prostitutes, but did so with particular sophistication, removing his victims' internal organs. The killer received his famous nickname thanks to one of his letters to reporters, in which he allegedly confessed to the crime and signed his name Jack the Ripper. However, researchers call this message a forgery, of which there were many at the time. Different versions attribute from 5 to 15 victims to Jack the Ripper, but most experts believe that there were 5. All were engaged in prostitution, all had their throats slit, and 3 had their internal organs removed. Today they are called the 5 canonical victims of Jack the Ripper. Some researchers add to this list a 6th woman whose murder was most likely also the work of a maniac. The killer chose girls of easy virtue as his victims, apparently believing that by doing so he was helping society get rid of vice and decadence. The cause of death was a slit throat. The organs were removed after the murder. The maniac's knowledge of human anatomy has given rise to many versions, never confirmed, about his affiliation with medicine and, in particular, surgery. Many believe that the skills of a butcher are quite enough for this. One of the victims was Mary Ann Nichols, a prostitute who spent an August evening in a pub on Brick Lane, and then returned to her usual place of residence on Trowell Street. This time, however, she was kicked out because she lacked a few pennies to pay her rent. So she set out to earn money in a way she knew well. That same night, 43-year-old Mary Ann was found in the street with her throat slit. This was the first known murder of Jack the Ripper. Annie, Elizabeth, Catherine, Mary Jane. All of them were killed by the maniac. A characteristic feature was that he strangled his victims or slit their throats and also removed women's organs. The Jack the Ripper was never caught due to lack of evidence. In 1892, the case was closed. The lack of evidence was not the only problem. From the very beginning, the story was subject to hoaxes because well-wishers sent false tips and evidence to the police. The grandson of Queen Victoria, Prince Albert Victor, or Van Gogh. There were many theories surrounding the identity of Jack the Ripper. Between the outright myths, there were very likely scenarios. What were all the suspicions based on? According to the testimony of a prostitute, only drafts of her testimony have survived. On November 3, 1888, an unknown tall man with curly blonde hair approached me on the street. He looked very respectable. He smelled of money and prosperity. He started talking to the prostitute, and then suddenly grabbed her by the throat and began to strangle her. These actions were prevented by a passerby. The man immediately loosened his grip, hit the woman on the head with a cane, and ran away. The cane was not cheap, but had a golden top depicting a lion's head. It was the kind of accessory that Crown Prince Albert Victor had. But the thing is that any wealthy Englishman could afford to have a similar cane, and on the day of the 3rd and 4th victims' murders, the prince was actually in Scotland, and during the other murders he was also outside London. Sir John Williams, a surgeon who treated Queen Victoria, was accused of the crimes. John Williams's wife, Lizzie Williams, also came under suspicion. People thought that Lizzie killed prostitutes because she could not have children herself. There was a version that the Ripper was the 5th victim, Mary Jane Kelly. They say that she killed her friends with particular cruelty, and eventually one of her roommates found out about it, tracked her down and killed her. The argument in favor of this version is that after Mary Jane's death, the murders stopped. According to one version, a mentally ill Polish emigrant, Aaron Kosminski, was hiding under the name of Jack the Ripper. This version was confirmed by the analysis of DNA samples, the results of which were published in the media in 2014. The study was conducted by Jari Louhilainen, an associate professor of molecular biology at Liverpool John Moores University. He took the genetic material necessary for the tests from a handkerchief allegedly found near the body of Catherine Eddowes, one of the victims of Jack the Ripper. It is known that in 2007 it was bought at auction by 48-year-old businessman Russell Edwards, who provided it to scientists for analysis. According to the businessman, one of the policemen who worked at the crime scene took the handkerchief home for his wife. As a result of the analyses, Mr. Louhilainen concluded that the DNA fragments found belonged to Catherine Eddowes and Aaron Kosminski. According to Russell Edwards, who published a book about his investigation in 2014, naming Jack the Ripper, the serial killer worked as a hairdresser in the London neighborhood of Whitechapel. Kosminski was one of the suspects in the Whitechapel murders, but the police were never able to prove his guilt. At the time of the first crimes in 1888, Kosminski was 23 years old. Later, he was also accused of trying to stab his sister to death, was recognized as mentally ill and in 1891 was sent for compulsory treatment. The murders were never repeated. The results of Edwards and Louhilinen's research were not properly published and were not subjected to scientific review. The correctness of the conclusions of genetic examinations also raised questions among experts. At various times, Montague schoolteacher John Druitt, who allegedly committed suicide, and hairdresser George Chapman, who was hanged for poisoning his 3 wives, were considered the Ripper. The list of suspects also included Thomas Neal Cream, who poisoned many women and was hanged in 1892. The hoax was fueled by letters Jack the Ripper allegedly sent to the police, newspapers, and public organizations. It was not possible to establish the authorship, but the name Jack the Ripper appears in the letter, and 2 letters contained human organs, an earlobe and a kidney. In addition to the unprecedented atrocity, the perpetrator, or his imitators, was publicity-seeking and obviously sought recognition for his activities. From the moment the investigation began, both police and journalists were literally inundated with letters of confession. Of course, most of them were a prank or someone's sick fantasy, but there were several messages among this pile that were apparently written by the killer's hand. The letter "Dear Boss" is known for giving the maniac his infamous name, Jack the Ripper. Later, the police officially recognized this message as a hoax. The scariest of the letters is called "From Hell." In addition to bravado and mockery, the sender enclosed a box containing a part of a human kidney. The author claimed that he had fried and eaten the other half. Undoubtedly, the funniest theory is the version that Jack the Ripper is the famous writer Lewis Carroll. In 1996, researcher Richard Wallace published a whole book on the subject. The author claims that he found anagrams in Carroll's works that confirm the writer's criminal activities. He says that if you take a few sentences from Carroll's books and swap the letters, you get a story about the crimes of the Whitechapel Killer. To be fair, Carroll did have an ambiguous reputation, but the brutal murders committed by the author of Alice in Wonderland are hardly believable.